Genesis chapter 12 verse 1 is clear that Abram must leave something behind before he is able to obtain the promises of God, and here, he must leave behind land. This had to have been difficult because Abram had to leave his family. Genesis chapter 12 verses 1 through 3 repeats a promise that God had said to Abram. God repeated the promise now that his father was dead, and Abram was compelled to a more complete obedience. But the promise was not taken away due to only partial obedience from Abram. But the promise was delayed, and this is a principle that many of us experience today. God tells Abram that he will make his name famous, which he does, as Abram's story is only beginning. In chapter 11, we read a lot about the plans of man. But in chapter 12, at least to this point, we see God's plans. We read a lot about I will, God will. And if God says something, then it will happen eventually. But as with Abram, like for each of us, in God's timing. We are not always ready at the exact moment for the promise, but God's timing is best. It's important to remember that Abram's dad, Terah, was not a Christian and worshipped false gods, so it's probably safe to assume that Abram's beliefs were pagan. But we cannot be certain about this. God does instruct Abram to leave the land, but he also promised to give him land. And from this land will a great nation be made. Genesis chapter 11 verse 30, the reader hears that Sarai is barren. This seemingly small detail in the genealogy of chapter 11 becomes a point of narrative tension in Genesis 12, when the Lord promises that Abram and his descendants will become a great nation. Again, God's promises will be met, and our actions do determine such promises. These promises were made to Abram, but they were based on obedience from Abram. And one was God blessing those who bless Abram, and it's through Abram that we are blessed. Not only was Abram promised blessing, but God also promised to make him a blessing, even to the point where all the families of the earth would be blessed in Abram. We read about Lot going with Abram. And while Abram was obedient to go out of this land, he takes Lot with him, so it's hard to say this was full obedience. And this happened at the age of 75, so Abram was not young when he left, so I imagine that it was probably even more unheard of for Abram and Sarai to have children. Abram came into Canaan as a stranger, and once there, he would come upon a notable oak tree known as the Oak of More. More is Hebrew for teacher. And it was common for cults to use nature, particularly trees, for messages from their gods. God does appear to Abram once they arrive in Canaan. And while Abram never owned any of this land, God's promise was enough evidence to assure Abram that he did indeed own the whole country. While we only assume, up until chapter 12, Abram had been of secular beliefs, so building an altar to God was something special, and this is similar to chapter 4. And how the people of land called on the name of the Lord after the banishment of Cain and the birth of Seth, even in the land God gave him. Abram never lived in a house, he always lived in a tent. And this is interesting, as tents are the home of those who are just passing through and do not put down permanent roots. When a famine hit the land, Abram went to Egypt. But Abram was wrong in thinking God would not provide for his needs in the place where God called him to live. God did protect Abram while in Egypt, but this was not part of the instructions. And we will learn, Abram came away with extra baggage. It is important to read verses 11 through 13 together to understand the full context of the scene, which unfolds. For the first time, we get a glimpse of Abram's fearfulness in spite of his belief in the promises of God. And we see this in the form of the lie. The lie told was Sarai was Abram's sister, but she was his half-sister. And while it was a small lie, his intention was to deceive fully. This lie was told to protect the couple rather than trusting God, so I hope you can see the contrast and conflict. This lie may not have been surrounded completely with dishonesty and deception, but Sarai was a woman of great beauty. The problems exist because he is just an immigrant seeking food for his people. From Abram's perspective, so he's wondering what's to keep the Egyptians from killing him to get his wife. As Abram feared, Sarai's beauty was an issue as she was seen and taken to Pharaoh's home. Not certain as to why this lie was used, but one reason may be that Sarai's husband would have had jealous seekers. But her brother would not have been a threat, so Abram came from a place of safety and concern. There are resources that suggest Pharaoh married Sarai, but this is not certain. And just one translation, but if this happened, Sarai was probably just one of the Pharaoh's wives. While the marriage is uncertain, Pharaoh did make some kind of payment to Abram, which included livestock, work animals, and human servants. Abram's scheme had increased his wealth, but lost him his wife. Despite what Abram had done, God does intervene, including the Lord afflicts Pharaoh's household with great plagues or diseases. Some scholars understand these plagues to be diseases of the skin. The Egyptians, those superstitious people, would have understood correctly that such plagues were a punishment for sin. Pharaoh is understandably upset with Abram, as he received great gifts of livestock, work animals, and human servants, all while remaining silent about the truth. Pharaoh summons Abram into his presence and begins to question him harshly. Think about what is on display. A pagan king recognized the moral crime of taking another man's wife, not Abram, but his deception nearly cost him his wife. Pharaoh concludes by returning Sarai to Abram and telling him to take her and go. What we see here is clear. It is becoming clear that God's promise to Abram is completely one-sided. No matter what Abram does, God will keep his promise to bless Abram, to protect him, and to make him and his offspring into a great nation. From Charles Spurgeon's November 29, 1868 sermon, Effectual Calling. He explains, if you desire to know the character of a child, you will probably learn much about it from observing the father. The young bird flies and sings as its father did before it. If we would know the life of the child of faith, we should study the history of the father of the faithful. Abraham, the man of faith, is a type of all believing men. And the narrative of his life, if rightly considered, is the mirror of the history of all the saints of God. The commencement of his career of faith, when he first became separated from his own country and went into the land of Canaan, is a most instructive representation of our effectual calling. When we are, by a work of omnipotent grace, separated from the world, and made to obey the great precept, come ye out from among them, be ye separate, and touch not the unclean thing, and I will receive you, and will be a father unto you. And ye shall be my sons and daughters.